All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist and my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And today I have a very special treat for all of you. I have Dr. Jan Kerkman, who is a lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Freiburg since the winter term of 2018 and 2019. Dr. Kerkman is currently a Feodor Lynen Research Fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation based at the Freie Universität in Berlin. Dr. Kirkman's systematic areas of specialization are metaphysics and the history of philosophy, especially ancient philosophy, early modern philosophy, and the philosophy of the 19th and 20th centuries. His other areas of interest include political philosophy and the philosophy of nature. Dr. Kerkman also focuses on Plato, Plotinus, Hobbes, Spinoza, Berkeley, Goethe, Schelling, Hölderlin, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, and his most recent publications are the following: Der Gott dieser Welt, die Entstehung und Wirklichkeit des Bösen by Augustinus und Schelling. That's from Tectum Verlag in 2024, as well as Unendlich Bewusstsein, Berkeley's Idealismus und diesen kritisch Weiterentwicklung by Kant und Schopenhauer. That's from De Gruyter in 2023, as well as Die Zeit des Willens und das Ende der Metaphysik, Heideggers Auseinandersetzung mit Nietzsche und Schelling, and many more on Heidegger and Nietzsche and Heraclitus. And believe it or not, he's also a marathon runner as well, too. So welcome, Dr. Kirkman, on the Young Idealist today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, and thanks for having me.
Well, I'm really excited for you to maybe guide us through Goethe's natural philosophy. So let's start off with a basic question. What is Goethe's natural philosophy?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Very good question. And I would start by outlining maybe the main take that Goethe, I think, has on natural philosophy. So I think we can locate Goethe in a landscape of his time where he encounters our two main approaches to natural philosophy. And I think the first one, we could call it maybe the empirical and experimental approach, which is, I think, founded and defended by Newton on the one hand. And I think that is still a very popular approach to nature. And on the other hand, I think there is that idealistic, speculative approach to nature, which is, for example, represented by Schelling, but I think also by Fichte. And I think Goethe tries to, at first glance, I have to admit, to rehabilitate and to defend a view where you have a more phenomenological approach to nature, or as it often called, a hermeneutic approach to nature, and also an approach to nature where you go back to perception, to intuition, so where you see how nature unfolds itself without limiting nature by an external standard, or by limiting nature because or through your presuppositions that you have maybe in a system like Fichte proposes or so. And I think that is a first way we can take maybe, and that is by differentiating or by showing how Goethe tries to maybe negate popular ways of finding the inner truths of nature. And I think what Goethe then maintains is that we have to admit that there is something like a divine ground which unfolds in nature. And maybe that is something we can discuss later on, that Goethe tries to bring together two main influences. And that is on the first hand Spinoza, and on the other hand Kant. And I think what Goethe takes from Spinoza is that there's something like a divine essence, and that this divine essence is a very powerful force and manifests itself in privileged forms of nature. And Goethe calls these privileged forms the Urphänomene, or the primordial phenomenon. Then Goethe, I think that is his main take on nature. He's trying to decipher the divine ground in every single being of nature. So he tries to combine that empirical view, where you just have to look at nature in its sensual phenomena, with the Spinoza's insight that everything is God in different modifications. So that would be maybe my insufficient answer, but I think it's just to approach and to get some ground. Yeah.
No, I think that was super clear, and I think we got a little taste of what we're going to discuss. So this is very good, actually. You brought up some mention of Kant and Spinoza. If you were to discuss the influences on Goethe's natural philosophy, now they could be philosophical, scientific, artistic, who are his main influences on his ideas of what nature is and his understanding or philosophical understanding of natural philosophy?
Yeah, very good question. And I think we can invoke Spinoza here because Spinoza, I think, is the first author that Goethe really studied, and he studied him very intensively during the 1770s. He got that recommendation to read Spinoza, I think, through Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, which is very well known for his controversial discussed Spinoza book written or published in 1785. And I think what Goethe learned from Spinoza is that you have to build a monistic system, or you have to find a monistic form, and that there are different levels through which that one force manifests itself. So you have to maintain that vertical, maybe, organization. And I think what Goethe then takes from Kant is that you can never be sure that you have understood that divine ground completely, because there's always something which is left for our understanding, which kind of withdraws from our understanding, because we are too limited. And we are so limited in our capacities that we can only think of things which are already limited, or which our soul limits itself to. And there's always something which surpasses our capacity. And I think what he also takes from Kant is that we have to search not for the main cause of nature or the main principles, but instead we have to find something like the conditions under which the phenomena appear. And then we have to be as modest as we can be, insofar that we have to know, okay, stop, we cannot go further, because if we want to go further, then it's mere speculating, and it's completely arbitrariness of what we choose there. We have to limit ourselves there, and we have to know that what unfolds itself in that limited area has to be something like the divine. So I would say these are the main influences, but I would also add something which is, I think, not so well known in Goethe research, or it is well known, but often we just try to circumvent it, and that is also that mystical or Kabbalistic influence on Goethe. I mean, Spinoza obviously read a lot of that Kabbalistic tradition, or that Jewish speculative tradition, and I think Goethe takes that also from Spinoza, but also, like, for example, the Fräulein von Klettenberg was an influence on him, on also, I think, also on his image of God, or his notion of nature also. And also, I would say that someone like Plotinus, I think his main Enneads weren't accessible during that time, but I think his thoughts were very popular. These three influences, so Spinoza, Kant, and that Neoplatonic thought, Goethe constructs, if you want me to say construct, because I think that sounds very subjectivist, so I think maybe that's not right, but I think you can explain foundations of his natural philosophy by referring to these three authors. And I think then that is something I just want to add, sorry. Then we also have to take into account Goethe's own experience of nature. And I think that is what makes him so super original, that he is not only referring to philosophical authors, but that he perceives and encounters nature on his own. And I think that view on nature is always mediated through Goethe's poetic or artistic account and interest. So, for example, just to give you one example, I think Goethe came to his interest in colors and also to his theory of colors because he was a painter, and he was interested in, okay, how can I bring colors together to get that impression and so on. And then he was concerned with the mixture of colors and then with the nature of colors. And I think that's very typical of Goethe, that he has a practical interest, and then that practical interest shifts into a theoretical interest because he wants to understand. So I think what I also love in Goethe and about Goethe is that he is curious. He's very curious. He wants to know everything, and that is not because of a Faustian drive to rule about nature or to dominate nature. It's because of that strive for understanding nature in its own laws and essence. And I think that he wants to understand nature in its own essence is already and always already inspired by his poetic talent, and that he then wants to worship nature by writing about nature. And I think that is something we can already see in his, I think the translation must be The Sorrows of the Young Werther, or Die Leiden des jungen Werther, where he has that youthful and genius view on nature. But I think that is something also trace through his whole work. Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you enough for such an in-depth, really in-depth understanding of Goethe's influences. I am also very sympathetic to the Kabbalistic, Neoplatonist, also theosophical reading. Franz von Baader and many of these thinkers, all these ideas are everywhere. And it's so funny, Schelling actually got his Spinoza books from Goethe when he was writing the Darstellung. So this is wonderful that there's such rich tapestry of all of these ideas around everywhere. In one of your essays, you talk about this vertical structure of nature. Could you maybe break down what this vertical structure is? You hinted at it a little bit in the introduction, but maybe you can give us a little bit more about what this is.
Certainly I try to. So I came to that notion that there could be something like a vertical structure in Goethe's approach to nature, because I read important work, Poetry and Truth, and there Goethe describes his first speculative approach to nature, and the idea that there has to be that first Trinity, which is very common, that traditional Christian Trinity that we all know. And then he asks himself, okay, but from that point, how can we get some development of nature, something like a process? There has to be something like a power which acts in the way of contraction, and which has to be selfish, and which has to be something which tries to leave everything in itself, and that nothing can go out. That principle he calls Lucifer, which is very interesting. And so there is something like a hierarchical order, and that hierarchical order is something we can bring into a succession of four different principles. So we have the first Trinity, and then we have that fourth principle. And that was something that I had to think about. Okay, maybe there could be something more than this. And then I had all these different essays that Goethe wrote, and I think that is something I have to add here. The research on Goethe's natural philosophy is so complicated because it's scattered around decades, and it's scattered around different texts, and we have just to pick it up and bring it into a systematic order. But I think that there are some assumptions that are consistent and that Goethe maintains through his works. And this assumption that there is something in nature, and I would justify that thesis by referring back to the essay Studie nach Spinoza, so a study according to Spinoza, and also, you mentioned it before, Bildungstrieb, and also something like Bedenken und Ergebung. I think it could be something like concern and devotion also, if we try to translate it. And there Goethe, and that was something which was very striking for me, always tells us that there is something he calls the Ungeheure, the monstrous maybe, or he calls it the incomprehensible life, or he calls it the divine, or he calls it the nisus formativus, the Bildungstrieb, or the formation drive. There is always that first principle that Goethe is aiming at, but he doesn't know how to describe it correctly. So it's something like a riddle. And I thought that Goethe, in all his essays, is trying to decipher or to discover how that riddle can be found and translated into something other. And so that was my first grasp on a super metaphysical entity that Goethe, I think, proposes. And then you can trace that back to his reception of Spinoza. But I think it is very important to see that Goethe is very differentiated, and he wants to maintain the different branches in which this divine ground radiates or shines. And so I was then looking for the second level, but it was not that I did that really intentionally. It just recognized it then, because I thought that there has to be one principle at least on which that Bildungstrieb can act and can from their own have some influence on the sensual beings. Then I read the text. It is called Erläuterung zu dem aphoristischen Aufsatz Die Natur. It's something like elucidation on that aphoristic writing on nature. And Goethe wrote that for the Chancellor Müller, and it's a very late text. It's from 1830, I guess, so 2 years before his death. There he tells us that there are two main driving wheels of nature, and these are polarity and intensification, or Steigerung in German. And that then gave me some notion that maybe these two driving forces of nature cannot be the highest, because I think they are antagonists. I think Goethe has that assumption that there is that divine force, which I think has a status being an axiomatic structure or principle. And then I thought, okay, maybe we can now look at the Urphänomene, or at the primordial phenomena, and then we can maybe bring them into a relation with that principles of intensification on the one hand and polarity. And what I then discovered was that I could indeed find some effects of these two principles in all the primordial phenomena. And I will just give you one example, and I think that's the primordial phenomenon of the leaf, which is the primordial phenomenon in the plant world. So it is the one main organ that you can discover in every development of the plant. So every part of the plant are the leaf, in fact. And Goethe proposes that plant, for example, has something like a bud, or then the blossom, of course, and also something like a stem, and that you can reveal the leaf as being that is there in the forms of contraction and expansion. So, for example, the blossom is a leaf in its expansion, and you can also encounter it in that forms of contraction. So, and that is, of course, something which is organized by that principle of polarity. And Goethe, I think, also elevates universal law, which you can find everywhere in nature. That universalistic notion, or that universal notion that Goethe attributed to that force or to that principle, was also very important for me to underpin that idea I had. And on the other hand, we have that principle of intensification. And of course, you need intensification if you want to make a sense of development or of motion, of dynamic. You cannot referring to something like polarity, because in order to bring polarity to move, there has to be something other. And so I tried to bring them together, and then I could also find manifestation of that principle of intensification in Goethe's attempt to explain the metamorphosis of plants from 1790, where he also describes that unfolding of plants being guided by intensification. And I could then also see or perceive that principle in different other branches of nature. And so I was sure, okay, there seems to be something I have to understand in a deeper way. And then it was the last hint I got was, or that I could add, Goethe's essay Erfahrung und Wissenschaft. I think it's often translated as empirical observation and science. And there Goethe describes something like a threefold order, which begins the empirical phenomenon and then strives to get to the higher layer of the scientific phenomenon, and at least we will maybe reach the pure phenomenon. And then Goethe attributes to the last stage we can reach something like a description like it is the first in itself, the first one in itself, but the last one that we can discover in nature. And that was very interesting, because then I got that proof that the Urphänomen transcends all the central phenomena, but is also in them as that archetypus which unfolds itself in them. But it is also something we can just encounter if we get rid of all that maybe random material, and if we also did a lot of experiments. And so then I could bring all these aspects together and came to that idea that we have the last part or the last example on that stage, which is occupied by the central phenomena. And for us, that is that kind of bottom-up approach we have to take. For us, they are the first one we have to encounter and we have to conduct research on. But on the other hand, Urphenomena are the last stage for us, and they are the conditions under which all the phenomena appear. But in themselves, they already invoke something which is even higher than they are. And this, of course, has to be the divine power, because Goethe often says the Urphenomena are symbols of the divine, which is, I think, also very important and I think supports my thesis. And on the other hand, if you want to understand what an Urphänomen is, of course, you can only do it if you have these principles of intensification on the one hand and polarity on the other hand. And so I just got my system. And I would admit that you never find that explicitly in Goethe. So there is no essay in which Goethe states, okay, I have four main principles and they are ordered in a step-like manner, and I'm a Neo-Platonist metaphysician, and here you have it. And now I'm doing just a lot of natural research to underpin that notion. So that's not the right view on it, and I concede that. But I think if we want to make Goethe fruitful for our times, and if we want to bring him into discussions with other natural philosophers, then we cannot be so modest as to just state, okay, he's interesting because he has a realist approach and he is perceiving central phenomena and he criticizes Newton, and that's great because we don't want that Newtonian science anymore. I mean, that's quite boring. I think we have to make him as strong as we can make him, and I think that Neoplatonist inspired view on Goethe could be one answer and maybe one attempt to do that.
See, what I found absolutely brilliant about this answer is that it's twofold. Number one, you're describing Goethe's natural philosophy as a kind of system of hypostases, almost in like Plotinus. But at the same time, you also have this kind of Spinozistic element in this, where you have polarity, intensification, the Bildungstrieb as the conatus, right? The striving to
Yeah,
be.
right.
And then
Yeah.
you also have this the element of the bud, the Urpflanze, right? The germ that is in all life. So maybe we can turn to this kind of modern reading of Spinoza. What is Goethe's modern reading of Spinoza? Because what I might add here is that even though you're reading a Neoplatonist Spinozist element to Goethe, they are really there. You have me. I agree with you. You have persuaded me that these arguments that you presented are not only organic and fresh, but also there is something to it. So maybe you can elaborate more on this, on Goethe's modern reading of
Yeah.
Spinoza.
Yeah, I try to. Thank you so much for that inspiring question. Very thought-provoking. I think Goethe's study according to Spinoza is very underrated in current research, because often we get that picture that Goethe is influenced by Spinoza, and that helps him to turn away from the traditional Christian view on nature, that we have a transcendent personal God which creates nature by only using his own will. That is also very Berkeleyan. So I have to, in my head, I have to try to defend also Berkeley's view against Goethe, but I think Goethe has a point in criticizing that traditional attempt. And I think that is how Goethe's study according to Spinoza is often understood and used. But I would say if we read it in that way, we give away all the potential that it has, because I think what Goethe proposes in his study according to Spinoza is that we can only understand what is limited. And I think that sounds trivial, because that is, of course, if we read Kant, we have to admit that, and we have to be very cautious to not transcend the capacities of our mind. But then I think Goethe makes a very interesting move, because he identifies the concept of existence and of perfection. So in German, it's something like Existenz und Vollkommenheit. And he says it's one and the same. And we can also find that in Spinoza's propositions. I think it's quite clear that it comes from there, that Spinoza is the source for that thesis. But then Goethe says if we trace that concept as far as we can do that, then we can say that we think of the infinite. But the infinite or complete existence, of course, cannot be thought by us, because we can only think things that are either limited or that our soul limits itself to. And then, but we have therefore, and I think that's a genius move and idea Goethe has, that we have therefore a concept of the infinite insofar as we can think that there is a complete existence which is beyond the comprehension of a limited mind. So we can think of God insofar as we can think of him as transcending our thinking. And I mean, for me, that was, okay, Søren Kierkegaard is already here in Goethe, and because I think that's a very paradoxical proof of the divine. And I think Kierkegaard also states that, right? If I remember correctly, that our understanding always striving to think of something or about something which we can never think of, and that is our understanding in despair. And Kant would say, yeah, Goethe, you are right. And therefore, you just have to be silent, because that are questions which are given to us by our own nature, but we cannot solve by using our reason. So that's something we can maybe then discuss in the antinomies, and we cannot resolve it. But Goethe, and I think that is his Spinozan view on that, is very keen to insist that, of course, we cannot solve it, but we can propose that there is something like a divine, or there must be something like a divine ground, or something like a deity, or something like a god, because there are limited beings. And there wouldn't be limited beings if there wouldn't be something like an infinite being. Then the question is, okay, how is the relationship between the finite beings and the infinite being? And then I think one traditional take on that would be, maybe they are participating in that divine. And I mean, a great philosopher, so Plato was, I think, the first one who had some theory of metaxis also. But I think Goethe is very influenced by Spinoza, that he would say, no, that cannot be the way in which we think of it, because the first principle, or the divine principle, has to be something that you cannot divide. I think Spinoza has a huge argumentation and a lot of theories in his ethics, where he always brings to mind that there can be no way in which you take the one substance and say, okay, maybe there's another substance, and maybe they share their being, or maybe there's a higher substance. So Spinoza, I think, takes a lot of effort to deny or to repudiate this notion. And Goethe, I think, follows him there, and argues that that first being has to be something which is only one, which cannot be divided into parts, and which also does not allow for other beings to divide it in itself. So, and then the question arises, okay, how can we think of participation? And then Goethe has that proto-Deleuzian answer to say, well, that's because the infinite being expresses itself or manifests itself. And what is it what manifests itself in the single and empirical beings? And of course, that cannot be something like a content or so, or like a material. It must be something, that is Goethe's answer, that is in itself the divine. And what is the divine? It's force. So it has to be never resting force, that vital strive, that conatus, as you mentioned it, that is derived from that single being, and then manifests itself in all the other beings. And then maybe you could criticize Goethe for being reductionist, maybe on that part, but I think that is a criticism we can reject, because Goethe then, by integrating or incorporating the two principles of intensification and polarity, draws a very differentiated picture. But I think that is his. So there are two main, very original, I think, thoughts in Goethe's study according to Spinoza. The first one is to describe the divine as something you cannot describe, or you cannot think of in a way that you grasp it totally. And I think, take Spinoza's ethics and just compare it, I think Spinoza satisfied by that view, because Spinoza would say there's one being which we can understood as clear as we can understand ourselves, and that is, of course, the divine. So I think Spinoza is a very bad source if you want to if you want to underpin negative theology also. And so Spinoza also says something like, if you understand one single being completely, then you understand God. And I think that is something that Goethe would reject. And so that is, I think, the first original thought he has, that we can think of something that we cannot think of, and that is God. And I think then the second very original thought is that relationship of expression. And that is original and also very fruitful and promising, because from that perspective, Goethe can criticize that Newtonian science.
Just before we head to Newton and Schelling, perhaps, maybe you could talk briefly about Goethe's own negative theology that you've kind of hinted at a tinge so far.
Yeah, I try to. So I would say that there are 4 different ways in which we can understand what Goethe means by his negative theology and how this negative theology proceeds. So I think the first approach that Goethe has is a conceptual approach. And I think that is the approach that he begins with in the study according to Spinoza. And I would call it conceptual because it works with concepts like the infinite, the finite, and then it tries to show how they relate to each other. And it is also conceptual because Goethe can formulate or articulate that proof of, or the negative proof of God without any reference to empirical or spatio-temporal beings. So there is no natural research in that study according to Spinoza, and that is why I would call it a completely conceptual approach. But I think we have also the hermeneutic approach, and that is an approach we can recognize, for example, in the essay you mentioned before with the name or with the title Bildungstrieb, because there Goethe tries to modify or tries to correct Blumenbach because he thinks that's a difficult word, and anthropomorphization or personification of that nisus formativus. And he said something like, if we just perceive nature, then we have to go further and further, and we have to presuppose something like that activity. And if we presuppose that activity, then we also have to presuppose something on which that activity can act. And so he goes from a mere observation of nature further and further, and he reaches the highest metaphysical levels. So I would say it's hermeneutic because he's just trying to make sense of his encounter with nature insofar as he can grasp it in empirical phenomena. So whereas the first approach starts from the highest concept and maybe can then be developed through all that layers of nature, and then maybe reaches the lowest area of nature. The second approach, the hermeneutic approach, starts by if I can bring that into that Platonic, Neoplatonic framework, the lowest area, and then is trying to progressing towards the highest. And then I think we also have the epistemological approach, which is, I think, very much related to the first one and the second one. And in that one, and I would use the essays, for example, Bedenken und Ergebung, and empirical observation and science to support that view. And I think there Goethe starts, or in that essay Bedenken und Ergebung, he starts with a devoted contemplation of nature. And then he says something like, if we observe the whole building of nature, we cannot ignore that the notion arises that there has to be an idea which grounds everything, that nature, I think it's something like that God is able to create and work in nature is able to create and work in God. And so I think it is related, the hermeneutic approach, because Goethe also starts from that general picture of nature and then goes down to reach the lowest layer. But I think what is also very interesting here is that Goethe also starts with something like a contemplation of the sublime. So there's something like a also theological admiration or worshipping of nature in play here. And in Erfahrung und Wissenschaft, which is maybe the most important essay that Goethe has written on his own method of natural research, strives to observe the empirical phenomena, and then he is doing some experiments in order to ascribe some, I think he calls it empirical law, and he ascribes that to the phenomena, and then he's trying to see whether all the empirical phenomena behave in that way that the empirical law predicts. And if it's the case, then he can be sure that he has found the empirical phenomenon. And then is also, maybe we can discuss that later because it's very complicated, I think, that procedure. But then he can go further and also climbs up to that highest level, which is then marked by or represented by the Ur-phenomena. So I think that is an epistemological approach, which is also twofold because it has that bottom-up approach, which is represented by that essay Erfahrung und Wissenschaft, and on the other hand that top-down, which is an approach that Goethe takes in Bedenken und Ergebung. And I think the last one, and I think that's the most fascinating, is that symbolic and negative theological approach as such. And I think it's symbolic because, and I think Goethe is great in performing and integrating riddles in his works. And I think the most interesting work is, of course, Faust 2, where we can a lot of or manifold examples of these riddles and enigmatic formulations, which are very difficult to explain and to understand. But I think it is insofar symbolic as the truth and also the Ur-phenomena are only symbols of the divine. But I think if we understand how the Ur-phenomena are working with nature and are also related to all the other phenomena, then we also understand how the will of nature is directed towards its own manifestation in the empirical phenomena. So I would say these are 4 maybe heuristic ways of describing how Goethe tries to find God. I think Goethe is a God seeker, and so he has different views, and we can maybe unravel these views and can maybe then show how they relate to each other. And so we can emulate Goethe's own activity insofar as Goethe tries to reveal how the Urphenomena are working with all the other phenomena, and how polarity and increase or intensification are mitigated and are striving towards and against each other. And we also can find ourselves in a Goethean operation insofar as we can maybe try to bring these 4 approaches in a maybe in a smart organization. And that is what was also my aim in different essays.
Well, you definitely have a very dynamic reading of Goethe, and you definitely are extremely persuasive because what your arguments are not only clear and precise, but they're very creative, and they express a lot in Goethe that I myself did not know was there. So I'm very, very happy to have learned this from you. I also love the excitement in your voice and in your gestures when you're talking
Thank
about
you.
Goethe. You can tell it's a love. He is a love of yours. You were saying
Yeah,
that.
but Chris, maybe if I can add something, because I have to tell you a story. It was not how can I say it? It was not my first big love in philosophy. So it wasn't that I had a relationship of love to Goethe in the beginning. In the beginning, it was something like it was. I wasn't very interested in Goethe at the beginning because we read him in school. I had the Deutsch Leistungskurs. I don't know how to translate it in English, but so it was in the Abitur. It was one of my subjects, and there we read Goethe's Faust, and I think that was a great experience, and I admired it. And when I look back, I'm very happy with that. But I was never very interested in Goethe's natural philosophy. But then there was that conference in 2018 on Schopenhauer and Goethe. And, I'm a Schopenhauerian. So I'm a big admirer of that philosophy because it fulfills everything that I love in philosophy. It's metaphysical, it's deep, it's kind of melancholic and pessimistic and so on. And you can find, I think, a friend if you read Schopenhauer. You find something who knows you very well. And then Professor Hühn told me, oh, maybe you could do something on Schopenhauer and Goethe. And then I know I was in the summer holidays and I read Goethe's Natural Philosophy for the first time. And I thought, oh my God, that is, I cannot make any sense of it. It is very confused. He's not very, he is clear in several essays, but then you got another essay and then you also have to grasp the meaning there. And it's complicated because because you have to see that Goethe tries to view nature from different angles. And if you don't understand, okay, that is that perspective that he's choosing now, then you cannot understand what Goethe's project is. And I think then I understood that it is something like a method because Goethe tries to combine or to bring together faith, reason, belief, emotion, something also like imagination, and therefore he has to be flexible and he has to be dynamic because only in that way he can depict what nature is in itself, because nature is also vital and dynamic and very versatile and flexible and very rich and manifold and ambivalent also.
We had originally talked about this idealistic, speculative, empirical, experimental, and how Goethe's view of nature is more hermeneutical in your words. But how does Goethe's philosophy of nature, or his natural philosophy, sorry, his natural philosophy, how does it differ from someone like Newton or even Schelling? Now,
Yeah.
with this kind of expansive approach, is there, to use a Schellingian term, I'm sorry, a Stufenfolge to his, is there a kind of ascending
Yeah.
series of
Yeah.
nature,
Yeah.
from this
Yeah.
bottom up that you're talking about? Or how would you describe his relationship to
Yeah.
Newton and
Yeah.
Schelling?
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent question. And I would concede that there. I have to, because that is my main assumption how we can read Goethe. That there is indeed a Stufenfolge, but I think we have to compare that Stufenfolge to Schelling's version, and I think in Schelling you have something, but please correct me, but I would say you have something like a goal of nature, and it is very anthropocentric, and or human beings are the goal which nature has to reach. And so we can we take ourselves as the pinnacle or the summit of nature, and then we just try to, okay, how I'm just provoking now, and it's in a very ironical way. But how can nature be so bright and so smart to produce something which is so great like human beings? And I think that could, yeah, if you, it's oversimplistic here, but I think you could say that. That could be Schelling's view on it, at least in the system of transcendental idealism. And I think so good. Schelling has a Stufenfolge which is directed towards human beings. And from there, he can degrade whole nature, or he can organize the whole nature insofar as he maybe evaluate it in terms of how far is it away from being human. And then, of course, I think plants are very low and animals are higher. And I think that's something you can also find in Schopenhauer, which is, I think, very close to Schelling here. But I think Goethe, by sticking or by referring to Spinoza's doctrine of the attributes, rejects that view. And he rejects that view because he can say, of course, Schelling, you are right, there is a Stufenfolge, but there's a Stufenfolge from the sensual phenomena, not to human beings, but to other phenomena, the Urphenomena, and then towards the divine. So I think the criterion or the paradigm on which Goethe organizes his Stufenfolge is power or is force. And I think in Schelling's view, the criterion or the standard on which he organizes his Stufenfolge is the human being, or is something like intelligence, or something like consciousness, or something like awareness or self-reflection. And I think that's very idealistic insofar as human beings are the highest form of reason, or are the bearer of reason, or the representatives of reason, and reason is the highest. And so nature has to run towards reason. And I think Goethe would say, no, of course, power is the most important thing and is the highest, and that power manifests everywhere. And we cannot say that one single being is higher or lower than another, or has more value than another, because it's the same divine power which is inherent in that being and in another being. So by that view, I think Goethe contests and rejects a view that is based on intelligence as paradigm. But of course, Goethe has that vertical order, but I think it's very tolerant and open, because it would not degrade one single being. It is more formal, if you want, more neutral, because it is based on the question, how can the highest being unfold itself in nature? And I think Schelling's account on nature is more based on that question, how can nature become aware of itself? Yeah.
Very, very, very thoughtful response. And I agree with you that Schelling's potencies that are, arising in this Stufenfolge are, its main goal, its telos is, for nature to become conscious of itself through human beings. So I agree with you on that. And I can see from your reading how Goethe's kind of organic understanding through Spinoza is a response to Newton's mechanical, I don't even know that's a word, mechanizing the cosmos. So, very thoughtful answer. Perhaps now, the final question, we can move to that highest principle, the Urphenomenon and the divine ground. So, what is this Urphenomenon and this divine ground in Goethe's natural philosophy?
Yeah, again, very exciting question, because I can give you not a single answer what the Urphänomen is, because I think it's not an individual being or an individual principle. There are a lot of Urphänomene. So I think it's very similar to Spinoza, because Spinoza says something like, we can only grasp two attributes of the divine, or of the one substance, extension and thinking, but there can be, or there must be, an infinite number of attributes. And Goethe wouldn't say there can be an infinite number of Urphänomene, but every realm or every area of nature has its own Urphänomen. And for example, maybe the most famous version of that Urphänomen would be, I think, light and darkness in the space of, or in the area of colors. But for Goethe, an Urphänomen is also something like the vertebrate type, something like an osteological pattern, and which, if it's encountered or if it's confronted by different circumstances, then it unfolds in a different way. An Urphänomen like the leaf. And I think the leaf is, for me, it's always interesting because you don't have that double structure there. I mean, you have light and darkness, and you have the vertebrate type and the circumstances, but there you only have one single entity, but it is also in so far doubled as it must make use of polarity and intensification, as we discussed before, in order to become the whole plant. And so I think Goethe is very keen to insist here that we cannot mix them, that we cannot merge one into the other, and that Urphänomen, and what's very interesting about it is that it is not a cause. So I think that is also something which could, I think, underpin or guide Goethe's criticism of Newton, or Newton's account of science, because I think Newton is always looking for, I have to find a cause and I have to find the effect, and that is that mechanical notion that you pointed out. And I think Goethe stresses that that is wrong, because you have a cause, and the cause is, of course, always that divine being. And then you have to see under which conditions that divine being shows itself or demonstrates its power. And that is through the filter, if you want, of the Urphänomene. And so you can, and I think it's also important that there are something like criteria of explanation, because if you want to understand a plant, you cannot do that without referring to the leaf, because otherwise you wouldn't have understood how the plant is functioning. And if you want to understand, for example, mammals or different types of animals, you cannot do that without referring to that main pattern, which is the vertebrate type. And also, I think that's Goethe is very famous for that insight. You cannot make sense of all the colors that are integrated in the world, or you can perceive in the world, if you have no idea of light and darkness. And Newton, for example, is a person who has not the right idea of light and darkness, and therefore he has to be criticized in a very polemical way, of course. But for me, it's very, very important that Goethe also, I think, utilizes that Aristotelian insight that we have to distinguish between the for us and in itself. And I think that is also something we can do with Kant, I think. So, because for us, we will never encounter the Urphänomen at first. But if we go through that sensory phenomena and we revealed, or we discovered that archetypal principle in it, then we are able to see the idea in the experience. So, and I think that's why, for example, Cassirer and Simmel are wrong when they say Goethe is something like a magician who can see the idea in the empirical phenomena. I think that's wrong. Goethe is not a magician or has something like superpower to perceive something in nature, but Goethe has just meticulously and very thoroughly did research on nature, and could then, through all that painful experiments, see, okay, that seems to be something like a principle that nature uses to organize itself, for example, regarding a plant. And then he can see that Urphänomen, but not at first glimpse or with the first view, but instead after a long period of very, I think, painful and stupefious experiments.
So you gave us a very, very intricate understanding of the sign of the Ur phenomenon, and its relationship to the divine ground. Did you want to say one last thing about, nature's or God's or whatever's divine ground before we wrap up, or?
Yeah. I think maybe one last word I could say about Goethe's methods, and because I think we have focused on Goethe's natural philosophy, and I think that's definitely right, and it's something we have to do in order to understand how Goethe is influenced by Spinoza and Kant, for example, and what his notion of Urphänomen means. But I think it's also crucial that Goethe tries to extend that view by using poetry, for example, and using arts, because that is how we can then come closer to the divine. Because if we see that philosophy is maybe a necessary condition to understand the structure and to understand the order of nature and to understand how urphenomena are related to all the other phenomena. And we also have to do a lot of natural research. There are a lot of experiments, but I think that's not sufficient if we want to maybe conceive of God or the divine. And therefore, we have to bring all the capacities of human nature together. And I think, like God is ever existing, ever moving, is a dynamic force, we also have to try to emulate and imitate the divine. And so insofar as there is a holistic nature which is guided by a single divine force, we also have to become a single unity, but not a unity that suppresses all the other forces that are in us, but that forms and shapes itself like a work of art. And therefore, I think Safransky is completely right when he wrote that wonderful book with the title Das Leben als Kunstwerk. And I think that life has to be a work of art is also directed to the recognition of nature, because nature is not a work of art, but nature is a holistic one because of that influence of the divine, which we can perceive everywhere. And follow Goethe's natural philosophy, it is not only that we are engaged with maybe the greatest minds that we had in Germany, but it's also that we are engaged with that project of defining oneself as a work of art. And that is why Goethe, I think, will be alive forever. Yeah.
Well, you summed up the conclusion quite nicely and very, 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 very
Thank
profoundly.
you very much.
I want to thank you so much for navigating us through many of these difficult ideas, Bildungstrieb, Urphenomenon, polarity, intuition, Goethe's understanding of what nature is, his influences, this beautiful vertical structure of nature, the system of hypostases that you have so nicely brought together. You brought really nicely this method of understanding Goethe's conception of nature. So I cannot thank you enough for being here and participating in this series and being a wonderful guest.
Thank you so much, Chris. You made it so easy for me, and you had so many great answers, and I enjoyed it very much and will follow your series, of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you.